we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone, to today's lunchtime webinar, where we are discussing parking reform for climate-smart communities. My name is Sarah Cardona. I'm Director of Climate Policy and Advocacy for Greenbelt Alliance. And we are really excited that you have joined us here today. We know there is a lot going on in our communities across our country, and I acknowledge that this is a really difficult and challenging time. So we really thank you for joining us for this discussion today that is even more important than ever. And for today, we coordinated with the city of San Jose to hear from a stellar group of transportation, housing, and development experts to discuss how modernizing municipal parking requirements can really help cities like San Jose achieve their climate goals. We may not realize it every single moment, but parking relates to many aspects of our daily life, including housing supply and cost, climate change and the environment, and even the walkability of a city. And so we have experts here this afternoon to unearth some of these connections with us. We'll also dig into transportation demand management, a term you may have heard, that describes ways that developers can make strategic investments at the site level to make it easier to bike, walk, and use shared vehicles or take public transit. And so I'd now like to welcome our speakers here today. We're so delighted to have Cheng from Transform, who is the program director of GreenTRIP there. Darin, Ranelletti, policy director for housing security with the city of Oakland. Matthew Reed, a policy manager with SB at Home. And Tim Woloshin, director of development at Urban Catalyst Fund. So thanks to each of you for spending your lunchtime with us. And just so that we can all get to know you a little bit more, I now invite each one of you to just take a moment to introduce yourself and what you're currently working on. And we'll start with Anne.
Hi, hello everyone. So I'm Cheng, and just thank you Greenbelt for organizing and hosting this discussion on what seems to be a very boring topic, but is really actually quite important, more important than most realize. And I absolutely did not think I would grow up working on parking policies this so focused over the last 14 years. I definitely stumbled upon it in my environmental biology and management training, and learning that, oh, this is a whole nother realm of human habitat management that I've had a great pleasure working in over the last couple decades. And so for those who haven't heard of Transform, we simply believe that if you can't get around safely and affordably, you can't get ahead. And our mission is focused on protecting climate as well as promoting social equity through housing and transportation policies at the local, regional, and state levels. And so in my last 14 years at Transform, I've been hyper-focused on developing policies, data, and online free tools to make it super easy to invest in spaces and homes for people rather than parking for cars. And I'm proud to have encouraged and worked with cities from Oakland over here to Richmond, Belmont, Sunnyvale to update codes that have in many cases been sitting for 50 years and are out of date.
Thank you, Anne. Welcome. Next, go to Darren.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Darin Ranelletti. I'm the policy director for housing security in the Oakland Mayor's office. And what that means is I primarily function as a advisor to Mayor Schaaf in her efforts to promote safe, healthy, secure, and affordable housing in Oakland. I've been doing that for about 2 years, but prior to that, I worked in the city's planning and building department. So I've been at the city for a total of 17 years, did a lot of work around zoning and parking, and happy to be here today to share with you some of my experiences from Oakland. So thank you to Greenbelt for organizing this. Really looking forward to
it. Great. Thank you, Darren. Matthew.
Great. Good afternoon, everybody. I am Matthew Reed here at Silicon Valley at Home. We are a housing advocacy organization in Santa Clara County. I come to this work from a pretty eclectic background, but the theme sort of throughout has been affordable housing and urban and community change. At SV at Home, we are working very hard to build and help to shape a valley that is vibrant and equitable, and that can be home to people of all incomes. Our focus is really on the production and preservation of affordable housing, but the housing crisis is so broad in our region that we find ourselves more and more focusing as well on housing development in general throughout the county. Accessibility is critical for lower income folks that do live in affordable housing. Access to transportation and cars is important, but the biggest barrier right now is cost and dedicated funds for affordable housing in cities throughout the region. And unfortunately, we become sort of experts at dealing with parking, because parking is a big part of the cost that goes into housing development right now. So I'm very pleased to be part of this discussion.
Great. Thank you, Matthew. Alluding to some of the things we'll be talking about in just a moment, but Tim, ask you to introduce yourself as well.
Hi, everyone. My name is Tim Woloshin. I'm Director of Development for Urban Catalyst Fund. Urban Catalyst is a San Jose-based developer. We have about 7 projects in the downtown San Jose core, or just a little bit slightly west of there, in the Darin station area. Urban Catalyst is a big believer in urbanism and high density development, because we also focus primarily on opportunity zone locations. Again, most of our projects are in the downtown core. We are generally quite forward thinking and open-minded when it comes to parking demand and the provision of parking for all of our projects. And we have several projects actually that are going forward with no attached parking in the downtown core. Very happy to be here.
Great, excellent. Well, really excited to hear all of your unique perspectives that you bring to this conversation. So I'm going to start with a few questions for the group, and then we'll reserve the final 10 minutes or so to answer questions from the audience. So please, all of you who have joined us here this afternoon, feel free to chat in the Q&A box any questions that you might have as we go along. So I'd like to actually start with Darren and talk about why cities have parking standards and why they might be counterproductive to our pursuits to create climate smart communities. Also really curious for you to share with us what were some of the reasons that the city of Oakland undertook eliminating parking minimums, and what have you learned from that change?
Sure. So quick overview for those of you who might be new to the topic. Cities are in the business of regulating parking, and they weren't always. But to understand when that happened and why it happened, we've got to go back about 100 years. It was the early 20th century when cities first started adopting zoning codes. And then after World War II, parking was added to those zoning codes. And those codes specify the amount of parking that's required to be developed with a development project. And Oakland adopted its first comprehensive set of parking standards in 1965. And so at that time, parking was, personal automobile use was exploding around the country. And the parking standards were a way to facilitate that, just like other necessary infrastructure associated with the development of a house. So you need water service, you need sewer service. So in the second half of the 20th century, cities started prescribing a certain amount of parking spaces that needed to be associated with new development. And as most of you probably know or understand, that auto-oriented approach to policy and development led to things like urban sprawl. And increasing emissions and air pollution, and a loss of open space, and all the things that Greenbelt Alliance and other folks are working towards. started to take shape, and planners in the latter part of the 20th century started realizing that we were losing our walkable, bikeable, transit-oriented, livable, healthy communities. And the focus on the automobile was a major part of that. So, fast forward to 2013, 14, 15, Oakland was adopting and updating a lot of its major policy documents. So the housing element to the general plan, we adopted a climate action plan, we adopted a transit first policy, a housing strategy, and all of those things encouraged compact, walkable, bikeable, transit-oriented, livable communities, and directed the city to update its zoning regulations to facilitate that. We saw that there was a major disconnect between our parking regulations, which I said, were established in 1965, and here we were in 2015. They really deserved a major overhaul. So that's what we did. In 2016, we overhauled the zoning code standards for parking. A couple of the major things that happened was we eliminated minimum parking requirements in downtown Oakland. That doesn't mean that parking isn't provided. It means that the city is not going to prescribe the minimum number. It means that each project can set its own parking based upon what's appropriate for its location and its type of project. Another thing we did was greatly reduce the minimum parking requirements along our transit corridors. And then we also made some somewhat under the radar changes that are actually pretty important. Things like not requiring new parking for a change of use of a building, not setting parking standards where they still remain based on the activity. So most cities say, if you have an office, you need to provide X number of parking spaces. If you have a restaurant, you need to provide X number of spaces. So, and all of that's based upon research that shows parking demand. So what that does is when you have a building that used to be an office and a restaurant wants to come in, it may not be allowed because there may not be enough parking space. So it does two things. It causes developers who want to have the flexibility in the future to accommodate as many businesses as possible, causes them to oversupply parking. And if enough parking isn't supplied to meet those code requirements, then certain businesses that are desirable for the community can't come in. So we've changed that. So now we have a form-based parking standard for commercial parking. If you're the ground floor of a building, X number of parking spaces are required. And if you're upper floor of a commercial building, X number of, Y number of spaces are provided. So it's based on the form of the building, allowing that building to be more flexibly used over time. I think it's important to point out that when we were having this parking debate in Oakland, it was not framed as whether we're pro-parking or anti-parking. We wanted parking to be just right. Too little parking is a problem and too much parking is a problem. And that it was more important for our parking to be reflective of our community goals and values, the outcomes that we wanted in a city to drive the parking requirements rather than vice versa. So we established high-level goals, what we wanted to get out of this effort. We collected data. So we looked at what was the parking ownership in developments across the city? What was the parking utilization? We're counting spaces in the middle of the night to see how much parking was actually being used. And we surveyed residents' attitude and behavior about parking. And all of that was developed into a proposal that we had a number of community workshops on, and eventually it was adopted by the city council. And I have to say, it started out pretty controversial, but at the end, through that process, it was surprisingly easy in terms of getting it adopted. And looking back now, it's been 4 years, and the end of the world didn't come. We certainly with every project, there's challenges around what's appropriate in terms of design and understanding impacts to the community, but and parking will always be important, folks. But I feel it's been successful. Oakland, up until a few months ago in the health pandemic, was experiencing a huge building boom. One of its biggest building booms ever, and supplying a large amount of much needed housing. I can't say that it was solely due to the parking update, but the parking update was one piece of many policy reforms that we undertook during that time that collectively has really facilitated the type of development that we were looking for. So we've been very pleased with it.
Darren, thank you so much. Such a helpful context and sort of history lesson reminder of where we got to where we are today, and just so encouraging that we have this local lesson that we can draw from in your experience, leading with goals and data. And you started to tee up really nicely where I'd like to go next and turn to Tim to unpack a little bit further the connection between parking and development. So Tim, from your vantage point, how does parking in general impact the development process, and in what ways does removing the constraint of minimum requirements benefit development, as I think Darren was kind of pointing to, as we've seen in Oakland?
Sure. On the first question, parking is integral to how we plan our project. So if we're talking about, say, an opportunity to look at a parcel of land and what type of housing development and density and housing type, whether it's going from a single family home, although we don't do single family homes, all the way up to a high density multifamily development. For example, in downtown San Jose, their general plan allows up to 800 units per acre, which is obviously very dense. But parking drives the design and the pro forma analysis from the very beginning. What we look for is we want to provide parking, and every project is really a little bit different. We're happy to be located in some downtown San Jose locations, as I mentioned, and we're taking a little bit of a long view where the plan, as we all know, is for BART to come through downtown San Jose and then all the way to Darin Station. So we're happy with being a little bit more relaxed on our parking standards, thinking about that long term. What we try to avoid is really having to excavate very, very deeply into the ground when we do our structured parking. Structured parking starts at $45,000 to $50,000 per space in just direct construction costs, and it only goes north from there. So the first level below ground is quite a bit more economical to build than, say, you're going 3 and 4 levels below ground. And so again, we try to avoid it because the deeper you go, the more expensive it gets. You're obviously digging a bigger hole. You've got to worry about where the water table is, how to keep water out, or how to properly accommodate that. The shoring, as you kind of go further into the ground, and underpinning of your neighbors, it becomes much more complicated, much more expensive. So we generally try to avoid doing that. And furthermore, what I just said about the $45,000 to $50,000, that's kind of, again, where we start. That's not necessarily including the land cost. So every project is really, looked at as, it's like any real estate, right? It's very heterogeneous. You have to look at each site, whether it's proximity to transit, who your target market is, what the density is that you're looking at. And evaluate it from there. And of course, what the lending environment is. Will you be able to get a loan to move forward on the project after you've done the entitlement? We have been generally we have a range of projects, and they're not all in the same location. So it's difficult to, again, look at it through the same lens. We often come in at around 1 space per dwelling unit. That's where we've been targeting, which is a little lighter than maybe traditionally. And to be clear, we're not building out our projects at the density of 800 units per acre. Although we do go very high in some of our downtown core. But for office, we have also, again, backed off some of our parking standards. We have several sites that are right in the downtown core. They're a little bit constrained, and each of those projects are not, they're not mega office projects. There's some developers who are going forward with very large projects in the downtown core. I can't speak to how they're parking theirs. We have a couple of smaller sites that are each about 100,000 square feet in size, and on each of those sites we're not providing parking at all. So we feel comfortable. We feel like, again, with the transit story, that we can find a tenant for these. I mean, we're in downtown San Jose, and in spite of what the short-term prognosis is, whether it's COVID or anything else, we are taking a long-term view. And again, we do remain very optimistic about the future of downtown San Jose.
Great, Tim. Thank you. So that was helpful as we're hearing a little bit more the relationship now between parking and what it's really costing in terms of development. I'd like to turn to both Matthew and Anne to hear a little bit more about what it might be costing us in terms of, what is the relationship between parking and housing, and specifically housing affordability? And either one of you can start.
I have a short answer because it's a really quite a simple relationship. And the way I frame it for the more financial types, it's essentially an opportunity cost. The more money and land you spend on car parking, the less money and land you have for housing, for deeper affordability, and for all the things that we actually want in a community that make a great community. So, and so to illustrate this point, we actually created our GreenTRIP parking database. And if you have another browser open, you can put in database.greentrip.org, and it literally shows you 80 actual developments and their parking utilization across the region, sorted all by place type and context and who lives in them and what kinds of folks live in them. And we found that of these 80 projects, almost 30% have unused spaces, excess spaces equivalent to almost $200 million and almost 1 million square feet. So I think we can all imagine what else we'd like to see happen with those dollars and that space. And so we actually built the database back in 2015, anticipating San Jose's parking code update. And so really happy to see that San Jose's got the funding to pursue this massive update in service of climate protection and housing. So we actually oversampled in our database 30 projects just in San Jose. So please do look at that and explore those sites.
Great, thanks. And I don't want to be a broken record, but the direct connection between costs and the ability to provide housing that's affordable to people is it's a tremendous challenge. And construction costs and land costs in general are very high and have been really a challenge for the industry in the last couple of years. It's the same environment that people are building affordable housing in. As Tim mentioned, it can be, I think he said 45 to 50. We usually estimate $60,000 to $80,000 a unit. And that's a tremendous additional cost burden for a project that is sort of skimping even without profit to provide access to folks with lower incomes. There is another side to this, though, which is that we're also really eager to provide access to places in the city and in the region where there are opportunities. And that means growth areas should not be shut off and exclusively available only to people that can pay $4,500 a month in rent. And so, the land is more expensive in these areas, and it's a real challenge. And again, parking is a critical part of that. The other challenge for us is we really believe that we have to get more dense, not less dense. And as Tim pointed out, It's expensive to build parking at higher densities because you usually have to go down. We don't have space. We can't afford space for our future for surface parking lots anywhere near transit or in downtown areas. And so it's just a challenge. Our belief, I think, and Tim mentioned, you need to lean in and plan for the future. And in affordable housing, often it means acknowledging that lower income folks use transit more than other people do, need fewer cars. Senior developments need far fewer parking spots to be functional and provide resources for residents, housing for people with lower incomes and disabilities. So it's an ongoing educational process of explaining how and why the cost challenges are extraordinary for affordable development, but also creating that inclusiveness means that maybe we're a little less immediately car dependent. I would just point one thing out, and I don't know that we'll get into this in detail. Parking is a huge issue in terms of community resistance to housing and affordable housing in particular. The concern that if you underpark a building, that parking will spill over into communities creates a tremendous barrier for local decision makers and builders as well. And so educating people about what, ways of addressing those concerns and all of the work that smart people are doing is critical, but also having the courage to be planning for the future. We have great discussions about bike parking, and I think the affordable housing development industry is really pushing and leading in some of these areas about what the future of transportation and mobility is going to be.
Matthew and Ann, thank you so much for very thoughtful insights. And I think we could have a whole webinar just on this one question. But I know, Ann, in particular, you have given some thought to this next question. So I'll turn this over to you. What are your additional thoughts around how our investments in parking and other forms of auto-centric infrastructure do impact equity in our communities?
Yeah, this is a very important question and is not something that you think parking and equity and how are they tied together. I'd say the situation we see playing out time and time again as we've created the GreenTRIP certification program, which is like LEED, but focused on transportation aspects of new housing, multifamily development, and supporting those developers like Tim who are trying to get the parking right and for the future to best meet the needs of our community goals, is that we hear residents coming out saying, we're all for affordable housing and more housing, but as Matt said, we don't want to be overwhelmed by traffic and lack of street parking. So please make sure you include more parking than necessary as a precaution. And it's a very natural, kind of intuitive kind of thought process. If you're just approaching this question for the first time, your concerned neighbor of a project is a very legitimate concern. But the problem is that burdening these projects with excess parking results in all these higher costs and literally kills projects. We have heard time and time again that it literally causes a project not to pencil, and by exacerbating this in this way and by adding on parking in a way to protect the needs of the current residents, it literally is equivalent to adding fuel to our housing crisis fire. And I think another issue is that not enough people know in our region that we've added 500,000 more jobs, and yet we've only, in the last 15 years, and we've only added 50,000 more homes. And so simply we're digging ourselves out of this tremendously deep hole, and we just can't afford to keep doing it in this way. And so ultimately we have to weigh, is my personal inconvenience of having to walk a little bit further down the street once in a while, is it really worth removing the opportunity for someone who likely cares for my kids for my parents, myself as an essential worker, feeding me, bringing the things I need, like to not allow those folks to live in our community. And we also have to ask ourselves, who gets to live where today? And to realize that racial and demographics of our nice communities with great access to quality green open space and safe, bikeable, walkable streets has everything to do with our systemic racial inequality built into oppressive zoning codes, redlining, lending, even our governments ourselves. So we're at a new generation. There's a lot of updating and right sizing of values at the end of the day, there is great hope, but we need to really just think thoroughly about this, and that while racist exclusionary zoning has created segregated communities, zoning can help desegregate them as well. And for me, as an ecologically trained urban planner, the data show that diversity is key to sustainability and economic progress. And we all know when it comes to urban forms, the Bay is mostly a monoculture of single family homes with 4 parking spaces per unit. And I know we are all smarter and we all can do better than that. So that's kind of, in my opinion, this is how it's all tied together.
Very powerful and poignantly said, Anne, thank you. And I like where you're helping us take a little bit of a step back in terms of our choices today and the future that we're creating. And so this next question is really for all of you to help us kind of think about how parking really relates to a broader issue of mobility, whether that's modes of getting around town, access to those mobility options, this wonky term, transportation demand management, or even transportation data. So wherever you'd like to take this response, but would invite each of you, whichever wants to start first, but yeah, help us unpack parking as it relates to mobility.
I can start. And to kind of get at some of the questions that are popping up in the Q&A, I think most of the folks on this webinar have expertise and experience in off-street parking, parking related to land use, zoning, development, and so forth. That's just one piece of the whole parking puzzle and mobility in general. There's certainly the on-street parking. There's also transit and emerging forms of mobility. I would say that in Oakland, we recognize that all these things work together. And yet it is so massive that, you need to take bite-sized pieces. It's hard to do one reform that addresses all of that. So when we did our parking update in Oakland, recognizing the importance just between off-street and on-street parking, we made the decision to only tackle off-street because it was already big enough by itself, and that if we had tackled on-street at the same time through pricing programs and permit programs, which is also really important, it would have been hard to do. So I think it's important to recognize that all those things go together, and yet you need to be realistic about what you can accomplish in a policymaking effort. So I'd encourage San Jose to think about that. Yes, all these things are related, but what can they do in what kind of sequence, and what can they coordinate to get at a long-term goal? What we did in Oakland on the off-street parking is we actually at the same time related it to 3 other important broader transportation planning efforts. In addition to updating the parking code, we also updated how we analyze and determine transportation impacts under the California Environmental Quality Act, CEQA. So we switched from a level of service-based impact, or LOS impact, to a vehicle miles traveled, or VMT impact, with the recognition that that was more consistent with city goals and state law for that matter. We also adopted for the first time a transportation impact fee, so that we could, while we were reducing parking, we could also generate funds to support our transportation system. And then lastly, we adopted a set of transportation demand management requirements for projects. So as we are providing more housing options and transportation options with folks, all these things work together. I think there's a misconception out there that, oh, we just eliminate parking requirements and then we're done. I think there's more to it. Yes, if you eliminate parking requirements, that doesn't mean that you need to not address the rest of your transportation system and the linkage between development and transportation. And B, there are other ways that you can do that through TDM fees. We set an impact fee that was quite low based on an economic feasibility analysis to make sure that it wouldn't impact the feasibility of new development, which many cities do, but some don't. And so, that's how we saw that piece fit into the broader framework of our transportation system.
As someone coming from the development side, I appreciate hearing that. In that, parking is a huge subject, and it does require policy decisions, and it does require regional solutions. Developers can't solve the parking problem simply through the provision of more parking. That's just not the solution that really anyone needs. It's funny when we have our meetings downtown or throughout downtown San Jose, like we almost exclusively use the scooters almost all the time. They're everywhere. I've appreciated that San Jose has been pretty open about the use of scooters compared maybe to some other cities in the Bay Area. We use them all the time. So I don't know what the future of mobility is in the terms of like these scooters or it's whatever the next thing is going to be. But we certainly use them a lot, and we see a lot of other people using them, and we appreciate the fact that they're there. As far as other future thoughts, I don't know, again, kind of notwithstanding my earlier comments about what the big long-term implications are from what we've been going through the past several months. It does seem like more people there's market demand for bicycles. So whether or not that really translates into more people riding bikes for their bicycle commuting, I guess we'll learn that over the next several years. In the past several years, there have been a lot more bike lanes added in San Jose, and they do a reasonably good job of separating them and to help keep cyclists safe. So we provide, the city of San Jose requires bike parking in all of their projects at a certain ratio, depending on what the use is. And in some cases, for example, with our office developments, we are also required to put in showers and like little locker rooms in our new office development, so that people who do ride bikes can take care of themselves when they get to the office. And so we're really excited about that, and hopefully these are trends that will stay with us.
Well, I'll jump in real quick. This is where I invite you to look at another tool we have called GreenTRIP Connect, where we literally took the data from our database as well as the statewide California household travel survey data to create a free online traffic climate calculator tool for anyone to use to see what a potential housing development could generate, and how adding things like free transit passes or free car share, bike share membership, things like reducing the parking supply and even charging for parking can directly change the expected traffic, climate, and parking use. And so it's called connect.greentrip.org, and I'll chat that into you all. But we released that in 2017, and it's been tremendously helpful to give and empower community groups, community members, council members, planning commissioners, everyone, instant access to seeing how context, place, and the affordability of of housing literally results in different outcomes. And it's credible, it's peer reviewed, it's actually recommended by the Governor's Office of Planning and Research for cities to use statewide in general plan updates. And so, I think our goal in creating that tool was to really get the analysis out to anyone. And what we saw is of our developers who've signed up for sort of GreenTRIP to meet GreenTRIP certification, over 50 developers, over 7,000 units, a third of which are affordable. We've been able to leverage private investment for public transit for up to $26 million. And so by working with cities to change their codes and do this on a structural level, we're really excited about the transformation of shifting away from car parking to all these other modes that are healthier, more affordable, and yeah, just, you know, it's adding to the diversity of options and resilience.
Great. Yeah, I would agree with everything. I think that the really important work that Ann and Transform are doing does two things. One is it says we don't understand where we actually are now. We overstate demand, and we don't understand how people move around all the time. But it also gives us a kind of a benchmark going forward. We really believe that part of the solution is going to be sort of internalizing trips that complete mixed income communities and mixed use communities, are really going to be essential. We believe that integrating affordable housing into those communities actually helps with the parking needs and the transportation balance. It supports the transit connectivity because those folks use transit more than other people do. And so, you know, figuring out how to create opportunities for people not to drive, and then acknowledging that mixing uses and mixing incomes in those spaces is all part of that solution is critical. I would also just say at a certain point, it's going to get more expensive to drive than to do something else. And depending on where you live and where you go to work, it's already there. And so we play a role in affecting that equation, and it's going to catch up with us, and we're going to be unprepared, or we're going to plan ahead and we're going to be prepared for it. What we don't want is very expensive parking that we no longer use and we don't know how to repurpose. And so being proactive about really creating opportunities for alternatives now is going to be really critical to the future of, I think, our cities in general, but San Jose in particular.
Well, thank you all. And Matthew, you're actually teeing up this last question that I have for all of you before we turn to hear some questions from the audience, which is, yes, then what will it take on our part to be thinking differently for that future? You all have kind of touched on, we need to balance this transformation that we need to see happening in our communities to meet housing needs, reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, create safe places where people can walk and bike. And so in your eyes, to any one of you, what does the future of cities across the Bay Area look like to you? And, what role does our land use policies like parking policy reform, what role can they play in promoting a more sustainable community in the future? It's a big question.
I'll jump in. I guess, in terms of this vision, what keeps me going and focused is that I'm already starting to see our vision for the future come to life. And really it's not as far as we think. And my hope is, and Transform's hope is that in 20 years from now, we can look down at satellite photos of our communities and see all those endless acres of parking lots surrounding malls, office parks turned into walkable, bikeable oases, filled with plenty of affordable housing to meet most of our needs, and homelessness is eliminated. And instead of 7 parking spaces for every car that exists and not enough housing for our people, where it needs to be, we essentially, most of us, hopefully everyone, can get this basic need of having a home and being able to walk out that front door and into a healthy, safe neighborhood. So the other piece, I'd say, more wonky, technical piece of the future is is actually addressing one of the questions around, yes, when we reduce off-street parking of individual developments, absolutely, you will see parking come into the neighborhood if it's not well managed. And so getting into a more sophisticated neighborhood parking management systems is absolutely what we are working on at Transform. We have a contract with BART to with using grant funds from Caltrans to support my hometown where I was a mayor in El Cerrito to convert the BART parking lot at Plaza BART into housing. And it's a very difficult conversation to take from folks who've expected to drive there all the time and to make room for folks who need homes there. And so part of this conversation started for me, back in 2008 when I was first elected, and even before when I was on the Planning Commission, getting our community ready to charge for parking, to use pricing as a way to manage access, and with the goal of no one should have to circle a block to find parking if they need it, but they'll just have to pay what's needed to get parking when they want it the most. And if they're wanting to get to it when there's not a lot of demand, well, likely it would be free. So looking at those solutions, more dynamic management, in my opinion, taking all that infrastructure cost that we were plowing into the set it and forget it mode of building garages can now go into human capital of management systems, monitoring, iterating and adjusting with each new phase of technology and disruption that comes down the line. So we can always hold in mind the top level of service. People can get to where they need to go using what they need. It just won't be free all the time. And of the monies collected from parking management, we would love to see that go back into the local community and have the community now have a new revenue source to decide, how do they want to make their streets safer? Is it, through, ambassadors or safety ambassadors or lighting or beautification, whatever it is, and giving community that understanding of, revenue back to local.
I'll jump in and say that I really appreciate the question, Sarah. I think it's interesting to think about the future of cities, and it's hard for me to answer it without thinking about the global health pandemic and the death of George Floyd and what's going on in this country. I think that starting with the pandemic, there's been a lot of questions, and some of them are popping up in the Q&A box about, does this mean that people are going to be working home and fleeing high-cost cities? What does that mean for the future of cities? I don't think we know for sure, but I have a feeling that cities will remain popular, attractive as places of high cultural and natural amenities, and particularly affluent households will continue to flock to cities. I don't think that's going to change. So I think that means that we need to continue planning for cities that accommodate all of the types of members of our community that are valuable to make those communities successful, so that they don't become just playgrounds for the rich. So I think that was evident before. I think that will continue. So I don't think that that's going to change post-COVID. And then when I think about the conversation around systemic racism that's happening right now, I think it's just a good reminder about the history of this country, and we've got a long way to go to correct those inequities. And everything that we're working on, whether it's parking or transportation or transit, has an implication for equity. And I think it's important that we have that racial equity framework when we're doing this kind of policy work. In 2017, the city of Oakland launched a citywide racial equity initiative, and that was after we did our parking update. I think if we were to do the parking update now, we'd have that front and center. When we did our energy and climate action plan in 2014, it was the ECAP. We're updating it now, and it's also the ECAP, but it's the equitable climate action plan. So we're layering that racial equity framework over all of our policymaking, and I just think going forward, everybody's going to need to do that.
Darren, thank you so much for offering those words. I think this is adding to additional resources and approaches that we can look into further for the next steps in work we have to do. Matthew, did you want to take on the
Yeah,
question?
just really quickly, I think the future of our cities is density. I think when we look back at what happened with COVID, we had frontline workers who lived in overcrowded housing, and it created a real health crisis that was not widely, everybody was affected by this, but there were some folks that were really hit hard. And it wasn't dense housing, it was overcrowded housing. And we're gonna learn that, and the solution is going to be to create more housing. We're gonna continue to grow, we need density. The point that I wanted to make was, it's a little bit insane that we're protecting single family neighborhoods right now in our cities that have close access to transit and to job hubs. San Jose's vision of mixed-use communities are all drawn around existing single-family neighborhoods, even if they're 2 blocks from a 15-minute bus line or light rail line, and we'll see what happens with the BART planning. So we need to be thinking about putting more people closer to alternatives to cars, and that's going to address parking. But that means that we're going to have to look at how exclusive and exclusionary some of the land use decisions that we've made in the past are, and we're going to need to fix that.
All right, well, I think now is a good time to turn to take some of our questions from the audience, some of which we're just kind of getting to here in our conversation. So this first one that I'll pose to anybody is, how does the increasing number of ADUs factor into the parking reform and climate smart cities efforts we're talking about here?
So we advocated very hard to make sure that the parking requirements were lifted in the ADU bills that went through the state. And the reason was cost. And the reason was flexibility and accessibility of the programs to existing homeowners. We think that's very important. There's a pushback that some of these neighborhoods are not transit accessible particularly, and we believe really strongly that when you create a range of opportunities at different price points in the city, people will stop commuting 90 minutes each way each day, and the positive impact in terms of sustainability, both of those communities but of the region, is going to be significant. Frequently we hear in public meetings that people are upset that other people might park in front of their house. Public streets are public streets. There are a lot of neighborhoods where there's space on the street to accommodate additional cars. We really need a kind of a collective commitment to solutions, and that means we're going to have to transform, we're going to have to change, we're going to have to be looking forward to a different future.
Thank you, and that actually addresses another question that we have here from the chat. Reducing parking, yes, usually then does spill out into neighborhoods, or that we see that happening. What are strategies to mitigate those impacts? And if we permit parking, who pays for setting it up and administering it? Good question.
I'll just jump in real quick as, I know San Jose actually is kind of struggling right now to figure out how to expand neighborhood parking permit districts, because they are expensive to manage and administer, and depending on how they're formed, the cost of the permit can't exceed the cost of enforcement. And so it is absolutely a challenge that our cities face, and from what we're hearing, cities really haven't recovered from the 2008 recession, and COVID is not going to help either. And so this lack of capacity is something that we are really transform with our state effort and our support for regional funding measures to really make sure cities get the resources they need, or state support they need to start pioneering these methods. And ideally, I understand BART is looking into applying for a grant that would help all of the Richmond line communities essentially work together. So if there's a bunch of smaller communities, maybe there's a cooperative approach. So I bet Darren has a lot more to say on this.
I don't have a great answer, Anne, but it's tough. Yeah, I think, part of me is like, the public right-of-way is the public right-of-way, and nobody, owns it or should have exclusive use to it. But another part of me thinks, again, this is this issue of, you don't want to overpark or underpark something. You want to get it just right. And that might mean in a particular area where there is concerns about spillover that maybe you do provide some more on-site parking. I think we're thinking that it's just like tons of parking or no parking. I think it's a gradual thing where we're seeing, a slight reduction in on-site parking coupled with some strategies that's based on data that show that there's less parking demand. So, I think one way to address those fears, if you're actually encountering it, is to go to some recent developments and look to see if there has been spillover. Sometimes there isn't. Sometimes the fear wasn't founded. Or go to GreenTRIP's database, and it shows you that there isn't the parking demand that people were thinking. So it's a tough thing. I think more communication, more education, more dialogue with the community is important.
Well, as we're getting close to wrapping up today's event, I'd like to close by asking each of our speakers to just take a minute and share with us what is one thing you'd like people to keep in mind or really take away from today's conversation. We'll start with whoever's ready.
I can start. I can say that I think that overall, when you combine what's happening at the policy level with what's happening with our cities, because I do think they will continue to grow, they will continue to become more dense. I think we're going to have less parking over time. Whether autonomous vehicles say happen in 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, where we're going to go with that, hopefully. Sounds almost a little bit utopian at this point, but that may not necessarily reduce the trip demand. You're still going to need people to go back and forth, but what it's going to do is it's going to free up land from parking restraints. The cars can go live somewhere else, where outside the city center, when they're not being used. And to Matthew's point as well, I think we'll have opportunities for adaptive reuse. As we go forward, where you can repurpose, and people are even designing buildings right now where one of the decks of the parking will be down the road, maybe office in like 10 or 12 years. So I think that this is a great conversation to be having, and I think that things are actually moving in the right direction on this.
I'll jump in here. I guess my ask for you all and my leave behind for you all is to encourage you all to go to a Zoom planning commission or a Zoom city council meeting near you where there's discussion about parking policy, housing projects. And if you already own a home, speak to the needs of those who don't already get to live in your community, because those are the voices are the most missing. And that lack of perpetual representation is a huge cause of our housing inequities. And it's very difficult for those folks who don't already live there to actually get to go to these meetings. Although in a Zoom world, maybe it's easier, but it's still challenging. And frankly, council members don't really welcome those who aren't actually voters, certain council members, but their voices need to be heard. And I invite you, if you have time, please use our tools to make the case, and let's get that housing we need and solve the climate crisis.
I'll jump in, and thank you. Very well said. I think we're facing a future that's going to strain a lot of the current strains that we're already experiencing, and it behooves us to be looking forward. The time it takes to get from office parks in Mountain View to central San Jose right now during rush hour is extraordinary and unsustainable. There's nothing that I see that slows that down. And so figuring out how to be planning for ways of moving people differently, how to be able to provide access to places that are currently inaccessible to people with lower incomes that work there, is going to be essential to the sustainability and the resilience of the region going forward. Support affordable housing, support higher density housing, particularly in transit areas where people can't quite envision a 5 or 6 story apartment building, but they should be, and they will need to in the future. So it's time to start now.
And I know we're out of time, Sarah, so I'll just really quickly say, here's my tips from Oakland. Frame the conversation as one of community values when you need to make trade-offs. It's important to know really what you want to achieve as a community. Our car is more important than people. Collect data, engage with the public. If you're afraid to try something citywide permanently, do a pilot, test something. And then finally, take your time. The parking update in Oakland took 2 years. I think it's better to do something right and deliberate and thoughtful rather than to rush it and to get and to have it encounter resistance. So take your time and build support, and you'll be much better off.
Well, I'd like to say a warm thank you to each of our panelists, Anne, Darren, Matthew, and Tim. Thanks for sharing your time and thoughts with us today. Such a rich conversation, a lot of meaningful things that we now can take home with us and to work on. And thanks to all of you for joining us and for hanging with us a few minutes beyond the hour here. Just a reminder that this webinar has been recorded. We talked about further educating others and raising awareness. So please share out the link that you will get in a post-event email. And please visit us at greenbelt.org, sign up for our newsletter, follow us on Facebook and Instagram, and please stay tuned for additional webinars as part of our summer webinar series. So thank you all and have a good rest of the day.